The soil came up dark, almost black, wet despite 3 weeks without rain. It was November 11th, 1988, and the workers had been digging in the backyard of 1426 F Street in Sacramento for less than an hour when the smell hit them. Not sewage, not rot from a broken pipe. Something older, heavier, deliberate. The foreman called the police. By noon, the garden tools had been replaced with crime scene tape, and by sunset, the nation would know the name Dorothea Puente. She was 79 years old. Grey hair styled weekly at the salon down the block. Floral dresses pressed with starch. She baked cookies for her tenants, drove them to medical appointments, and smiled at everyone who passed her immaculate Victorian boarding house. The neighbors called her a saint. The elderly and disabled who rented rooms from her called her grandma. And beneath her rose bushes, wrapped in bed sheets and garbage bags, 7 bodies were rotting in shallow graves. This is not a story about a monster. This is a story about a grandmother who turned compassion into currency and murder into routine. Because Dorothea Puente understood something most killers don't. That society has a blind spot. The poor, the addicted, the mentally ill, the forgotten. If you care for them just enough to keep them quiet, no one asks questions. And if they disappear, no one comes looking. This is the story of how a sweet old woman transformed her boarding house into a graveyard. How she served tea while bodies decomposed in her garden. How she cashed social security checks for the dead and smiled through every lie. And how, even after being caught standing over fresh graves, she looked investigators in the eye and said she'd done nothing wrong. The archive folder arrived at my desk in a plain manila envelope, no return address, just a note paperclipped to the front. You asked about the Sacramento case. This is what they didn't publish. Inside were photocopies of police reports, coroner's notes, and photographs that had been sealed for decades. Some were stamped evidence, trial exhibit. Others bore no markings at all, as if someone had simply removed them from the official record and kept them in a drawer, waiting. I spread them across my table under the desk lamp. The first image showed a boarding house, pale blue with white trim, flower boxes in every window. It looked like the kind of place you'd trust to care for your aging mother. The second photograph was taken from the same angle, but the lawn had been excavated into a grid. Yellow markers numbered 1 through 7. And in the margins, someone had written in faded pencil, "More suspected under porch." The case file opened with a biography so ordinary it felt like camouflage. Dorothea Helen Gray, born January 9, 1929, in Redlands, California. Her childhood read like a template for future cruelty. Father died of tuberculosis when she was 6. Mother was an alcoholic who cycled through men and bars, leaving Dorothea and her siblings to fend for themselves in orphanages and foster homes. She was sexually abused by a caretaker at age 8. By 16, she was pregnant and alone. The pattern established itself early. Lie, charm, survive. Her first arrest came in 1948 for forging checks. She served 4 months. By the time she was released, she'd married, divorced, and moved to a new town under a new name. Over the next 3 decades, Dorothea would marry 4 times, always to men older and wealthier than herself. She took their names, their money, and when they became inconvenient, she left. But it was in the 1970s that Dorothea found her true calling. She would open a boarding house for the vulnerable, the elderly, the disabled, those on government assistance. She would collect their checks, forge their signatures, and if they complained, if they threatened to leave, if they became too expensive to keep alive, she would make them disappear. The psychological evaluation I found buried in the file was dated 1982, written by a prison psychiatrist after Dorothea had been convicted of drugging elderly men in bars and robbing them. The doctor's notes were clinical, detached. Subject presents with marked grandiosity, pathological lying, and absence of remorse. Exhibits charm when beneficial, aggression when challenged. Recommendation: minimum 5-year sentence. But Dorothea was released after 3 years for good behavior. Even behind bars, she knew how to smile. I turned the page and found a letter she'd written to the parole board. Her handwriting was neat, almost childlike. "I have learned from my mistakes," she wrote. "I wish only to serve others and make amends for the pain I have caused." It worked. In 1985, Dorothea Puente walked out of prison, rented a large Victorian house at 1426 F Street, and within months she was back in business. The house itself was a stage set. I've studied crime scene photographs for years, and certain places carry a weight you can feel even through images. This one radiated performance. Every room was decorated with lace doilies, porcelain figurines, and framed Bible verses. The dining room table seated 12. The kitchen smelled of fresh bread. Upstairs, 19 small rooms had been carved out of what was once a family home, each barely large enough for a bed and dresser. Dorothea advertised in local papers. Rooms for rent, assistants welcome, caring environment. Social workers referred clients to her. Parole officers sent parolees. The city's mental health services placed patients there when hospitals discharged them with nowhere to go. Everyone believed Dorothea Puente had been rehabilitated. Everyone believed she was helping. Her tenants were perfect victims. Alvaro Montoya, 51, schizophrenic, no family. Leona Carpenter, 78, senile, estranged from her children. Dorothy Miller, 64, paranoid, alcoholic, alone. They moved into 1426 F Street because they had nowhere else to go. And once inside, Dorothea controlled everything. Their mail, their medication, their contact with the outside world. She required them to sign over their social security checks as payment for rent and care. Most never questioned it. They were grateful for a clean bed and warm meals. They trusted her because she looked like someone's grandmother. And when they became inconvenient, when they grew too sick or too difficult or simply too expensive to maintain, Dorothea would slip sedatives into their evening tea, wait for them to lose consciousness, and smother them with a pillow. The first body discovered on November 11, 1988, was a woman, later identified as Leona Carpenter. She'd been buried face down, wrapped in bed sheets, her hands folded across her chest as if someone had arranged her for a viewing. The coroner's initial notes described the remains as partially mummified due to the lime Dorothea had poured over the grave to mask decomposition. Within hours, investigators found a second body. Then a third. By the end of the week, 7 corpses had been unearthed from Dorothea Puente's garden. The medical examiner would later testify that most had died from drug overdoses, specifically a combination of codeine and Tylenol, the same prescription medications Dorothea kept in a locked cabinet in her bedroom. What disturbed investigators most wasn't the number of bodies. It was the routine. Each grave was dug to the same depth, approximately 3 feet. Each body was wrapped in identical bed linens. Each burial site was marked by a small shrub or rosebush, planted with care. Dorothea hadn't just killed her tenants. She'd turned murder into gardening. I found a handwritten inventory list among the evidence files, presumably created by Dorothea herself. It was dated 1987, 1 year before the bodies were discovered. The entries were meticulous. Tenant name, social security number, monthly check amount, burial location. One line read, Carpenter, L, $600 per month. Garden, northeast corner, under roses. Continue payments until notice. The phrase continue payments chilled me. It meant Dorothea had been cashing the social security checks of the dead for months, sometimes years, after burying them. The fraud wasn't incidental to the murders. It was the motive. She killed to keep the money flowing. But how had she gotten away with it for so long? The answer lay in a system designed to help the vulnerable but built on trust and minimal oversight. Social security checks in the 1980s were mailed directly to recipients or their designated representatives. Dorothea, as landlord and caretaker, was authorized to receive and cash checks on behalf of tenants who couldn't manage their own finances. Once a tenant died, Dorothea simply continued cashing their checks. If anyone asked where the person was, she'd say they'd moved to Utah or gone to live with family. And because her tenants were people society had already forgotten, no one followed up. No family called. No social worker visited. The checks kept arriving, and Dorothea kept cashing them. I cross-referenced the burial dates with bank records subpoenaed during the investigation. In one instance, Dorothea cashed a dead woman's check the same day she buried her. The transaction was noted in neat handwriting on a deposit slip found in her bedroom. Dorothy M., $531, deposited the 14th of November, 87. The grave, according to police excavation notes, was marked with a fresh planting of lavender. Reading that, I understood the true horror of Dorothea Puente. She didn't kill in rage or passion. She killed with the same efficiency most people apply to balancing a checkbook. Murder had become a business decision, and her garden was the ledger. The day the bodies were discovered, Dorothea Puente was not at home. She'd left that morning before the digging began, telling investigators she needed to run errands. She walked calmly to a nearby cafe, ordered coffee, and struck up a conversation with an elderly man sitting alone. His name was Charles Wilkes, 77, a retired carpenter. Within an hour, Dorothea had convinced him to let her stay at his apartment. For 5 days, while police unearthed corpses from her garden and the media swarmed F Street, Dorothea Puente lived quietly in Charles Wilkes' spare bedroom. She cooked him meals, watched television, and never once mentioned the boarding house or the investigation. Charles later told reporters he had no idea who she was. "She seemed like a nice lady," he said. "Very polite." It was only when a bartender recognized Dorothea from a televised press conference that police were alerted. On November 17th, officers arrived at Charles Wilkes' apartment and found Dorothea sitting at the kitchen table, peeling potatoes. She looked up, smiled, and said, "I was wondering when you'd come." The interrogation transcripts reveal a woman utterly unbothered by the evidence against her. When detectives showed her photographs of the graves, she shrugged. "I don't know how those people got there." When asked about the Social Security checks, she claimed her tenants had authorized her to manage their finances. When confronted with the inventory list in her own handwriting, she said it must have been forged. Her attorney later described her as the most composed defendant he'd ever represented. She never wept, never shouted, never showed fear. In court, she wore pastel dresses and pearl earrings, smiling at the jury as if she were attending a church social rather than a murder trial. One prosecutor wrote in his notes, "She believes her own lies, or she's the best actress I've ever seen." I think it was neither. I think Dorothea Puente had spent so many decades constructing false identities that the line between performance and reality had dissolved. She wasn't pretending to be a kind grandmother. In her mind, she was one. The murders were simply an unfortunate necessity, a practical solution to financial problems. She'd rationalized each death so thoroughly that guilt had no entry point. The trial began in February 1993, nearly 5 years after the bodies were discovered. The delay was due to the complexity of the case. Prosecutors had to prove not only that Dorothea had killed her tenants, but that she'd done so with premeditation and for financial gain. The evidence was overwhelming, but entirely circumstantial. No witnesses had seen her administer drugs or smother victims. No confessions existed. The case would rest on forensics, financial records, and the testimony of survivors. One of those survivors was John Sharp, a 52-year-old veteran who had lived at 1426 F Street for 6 months in 1987. He testified that Dorothea controlled every aspect of residents' lives. "She collected the mail," she said. "She kept our medications locked in her room and gave us pills at mealtimes. If you questioned her, she'd threaten to kick you out. And for people like us, being kicked out meant the street." John described an incident where another tenant, a man named Bert Montoya, had complained about missing money from his wallet. That night, Bert became violently ill. Dorothea claimed it was food poisoning and insisted he stay in bed. John never saw Bert again. When he asked where Bert had gone, Dorothea said he'd moved to Mexico. 2 weeks later, police would find Bert Montoya's body buried beneath the front porch. The forensic evidence was damning. Autopsies revealed that all 7 victims had died from drug overdoses, specifically combinations of sedatives and painkillers that Dorothea kept in her possession. Toxicology reports showed lethal levels of codeine, Dalmanir, and Tylenol in tissue samples. One victim, Dorothy Miller, had enough drugs in her system to kill 3 people. But the prosecution's strongest evidence was financial. Bank records showed that Dorothea had deposited over $150,000 in Social Security checks between 1985 and 1988, far more than her tenant roster could account for. Investigators matched deposit dates with burial dates and found a pattern. Within days of each death, Dorothea made large cash withdrawals, often followed by purchases of lime, shovels, and bed linens. One receipt, found crumpled in her trash, was dated November 10, 1988, one day before the bodies were discovered. It listed 3 bags of lime and a box of heavy-duty garbage bags. The cashier who sold her the items testified that Dorothea had been cheerful, even chatty. "She told me she was planting a new garden," the cashier said. "She seemed excited about it." The defense argued that Dorothea was a scapegoat, that her tenants had died of natural causes or accidental overdoses, and that someone else, perhaps a drug dealer or angry relative, had buried the bodies to frame her. It was a desperate strategy, and the jury didn't buy it. But what surprised me, reading the trial transcripts, was how close the defense came to succeeding. Dorothea never testified, but her attorney painted her as a victim of circumstance. She was a woman who had dedicated her life to caring for society's most vulnerable, he argued, only to be vilified when tragedy struck. He pointed out that no physical evidence, no fingerprints, no DNA, no murder weapon, directly linked her to the deaths. Everything was inference, he said. Coincidence, not culpability. The jury deliberated for 24 days, one of the longest deliberations in California history. They convicted Dorothea of 3 counts of first-degree murder but deadlocked on the remaining charges. The judge declared a mistrial on those counts. Dorothea showed no reaction. She simply nodded, as if the verdict confirmed what she'd known all along. Sentencing came on December 10, 1993. The judge, clearly disturbed by the case, addressed Dorothea directly. "You have taken lives without remorse," he said. "You have turned trust into a weapon and compassion into fraud. I sentence you to life in prison without the possibility of parole." Dorothea smiled, thanked him, and was led away in handcuffs. She would spend the rest of her life at the Central California Women's Facility in Chowchilla, a maximum security prison 2 hours south of Sacramento. Even there, she maintained her performance. She cooked for other inmates, taught sewing classes, and gave interviews to journalists, always insisting she was innocent. "I never hurt anyone," she told one reporter in 2001. "Those people were sick when they came to me. I did my best to care for them." But in private, according to guards who spoke off the record, Dorothea was different. She hoarded commissary snacks, bullied weaker inmates, and kept a notebook filled with names and addresses of people she claimed owed her money. One guard described her as calculating, always working an angle. She never stopped scheming. Dorothea Puente died on March 27, 2011, at the age of 82. The cause was natural, a phrase that felt obscene given her crimes. She was buried in an unmarked grave, no family present, no mourners. The prison chaplain who officiated later said it was the emptiest funeral he'd ever conducted. Even the other inmates refused to attend. But the story didn't end with her death. The house at 1426 F Street still stands, though it's been renovated and sold multiple times. No tenant stays long. They complain of strange smells, cold spots, and the persistent feeling of being watched. One renter told a local newspaper she heard footsteps in the garden at night, the rhythmic sound of digging. The city of Sacramento tried to erase the memory. The address was changed. The garden was paved over. But every few years, the case resurfaces. A documentary airs, a podcast episode drops, and suddenly the street fills with curiosity seekers taking photographs and asking neighbors about the landlady who buried her tenants. What disturbs people most, I think, isn't the number of victims or the brutality of the crimes. It's the ordinariness of Dorothea Puente. She looked like someone's grandmother. She baked cookies and attended church. She smiled and waved and blended seamlessly into her community. Evil, we want to believe, announces itself. But Dorothea proved that sometimes evil just looks tired and helpful and offers you a cup of tea. Reading through the case files, I found myself returning to one detail again and again. In her bedroom, police discovered a photo album filled with pictures of her tenants. Some were posed portraits, others candid shots of people eating meals or sitting in the garden. Beneath each photograph, Dorothea had written captions in neat cursive. Leona, Easter Sunday, 1987. Bert, enjoying the sunshine. Dorothy, my dear friend. These weren't the photographs of a killer. They were the photographs of someone who genuinely believed she was caring for these people. Or perhaps, more disturbingly, someone who needed to believe that. Because if Dorothea Puente was a caretaker, then the deaths were unfortunate accidents. And if they were accidents, then she wasn't a monster. But the graves told a different story. 7 bodies, buried with precision, each wrapped and weighted, each marked with flowers. That wasn't accident. That was ritual. And rituals require intention. The psychological profile compiled after her conviction described Dorothea as a malignant narcissist with sociopathic tendencies. She views others as objects, the psychiatrist wrote, tools to be used and discarded when no longer useful. Her charm is not genuine warmth but a survival mechanism honed over decades of manipulation. Yet even that diagnosis felt incomplete. Because Dorothea wasn't simply manipulating people for pleasure or power. She was managing them like assets. The inventory list, the meticulous record-keeping, the calculated timing of deposits and burials, it all pointed to someone who saw murder as a business model. I began to see the case as less about individual crimes and more about a system that enabled them. Dorothea Puente thrived because society had created a population of invisible people. The elderly poor, the mentally ill, the addicted, these were people the system had failed long before Dorothea ever met them. Social Security didn't follow up on missing recipients. Hospitals discharged patients with nowhere to go. Families abandoned relatives who became too difficult to manage. And into that void stepped Dorothea Puente, offering shelter and care with one hand while digging graves with the other. The tragedy isn't just that she killed. It's that she was allowed to kill again and again, because no one was watching. And when the bodies were finally discovered, the response wasn't systemic reform. It was individual prosecution. Dorothea went to prison, but the conditions that enabled her remained unchanged. I found a letter in the archive, written by a social worker who had placed 3 clients at 1426 F Street. It was dated 1989, months after the bodies were unearthed. I didn't know, the letter read. I visited the house twice and it seemed clean, well run. Mrs. Puente was always so kind. How was I supposed to know? That question haunted me. How was anyone supposed to know? Dorothea had perfected the mask. She knew what social workers wanted to see: clean floors, warm meals, polite conversation, and she provided it. The horror was hidden beneath floorboards and garden soil, invisible until someone started digging. But there were signs. Tenants who disappeared without explanation. Checks that kept being cashed for people no one had seen in months. Neighbors who noticed Dorothea digging in her garden late at night. The signs were there, but they required someone to connect them, to care enough to ask questions.
And that's the true indictment of the Dorothea Puente case. Not that one woman became a serial killer, but that an entire system, from social services to law enforcement to the banking industry, failed to notice or act until 7 people were dead and buried in a garden.
The deeper I dug into the archive, the more the case revealed itself as a kind of American parable. Not about evil, but about invisibility. I found intake forms from the Sacramento County Mental Health Department, referrals dating back to 1985. Dozens of names, each with a note in the margin. Placed with D. Puente, F Street. Stable housing secured. Stable housing. The phrase appeared again and again, bureaucratic shorthand for a problem solved. But for many of those names, placement with Dorothea Puente was the last entry in their file. No follow-up visits noted. No status updates. Just a date, an address, and then nothing. I cross-referenced the placement list with the names of Dorothea's known victims. 4 matches. For people the county had placed directly into her care, people the system was supposed to monitor, and then forgot. 1 social worker,
when questioned during the investigation, admitted she'd never actually visited 1426 F Street. "I called to check in," she said. "Mrs. Puente always assured me everything was fine." That reliance on Dorothea's word, that willingness to trust without verifying, enabled everything that followed. Because Dorothea understood that busy social workers with overwhelming caseloads wanted easy answers. If she said a tenant had moved or died peacefully in their sleep, they believed her. It was simpler than investigating. I found a memo dated 1986, circulated among Sacramento social services staff. It praised Dorothea Puente as a model care provider and encouraged workers to prioritize placements at her facility. The memo was signed by a department supervisor who, years later, would testify that he'd never actually met Dorothea. He'd simply heard good things. That memo became evidence at trial, not of Dorothea's innocence, but of systemic negligence. The prosecution argued that the county had essentially created a pipeline of vulnerable victims, delivering them directly to a serial killer's door. The defense argued that Dorothea had deceived everyone, that she was a master manipulator who could fool even trained professionals. Both arguments were true, and that's what made the case so disturbing. Yes, Dorothea was calculating and cruel, but she was also enabled by a system that valued efficiency over safety, paperwork over people. The survivors I was able to track down, those who'd lived at 1426 F Street and escaped before Dorothea killed them, all told variations of the same story. At first, the house seemed like salvation. Clean rooms, regular meals, a landlady who called them dear and sweetie and made them feel cared for. But gradually, the control tightened. Malcolm Mackenzie, 68, lived there for 8 months in 1986. He described the routine in his police statement. Every morning, Dorothea would knock on our doors with medication. She said it was vitamins and blood pressure pills. If you refused, she'd get angry, say you were ungrateful. So we took them. And then we'd feel foggy all day, like we couldn't quite wake up. Malcolm left after he noticed other tenants disappearing. One week there'd be 8 of us at dinner, he said, and the next week only 5. When I asked where people went, Dorothea would say they'd found better housing or gone to live with family. But their belongings were still in their rooms. Their mail still arrived. Something wasn't right. He packed his things one night while Dorothea was out and never returned. When police interviewed him 3 years later, during the murder investigation, he wept. "I could have said something," he told detectives. "I knew something was wrong. But I had nowhere else to go. And I was scared she'd hurt me if I talked." That fear, that understanding that speaking up meant homelessness, kept Dorothea's operation running smoothly for years. Her tenants weren't just physically trapped by poverty and disability. They were psychologically trapped by the knowledge that she held power over their survival.
Another survivor, Patricia Morgan, described Dorothea's mood swings. She could be sweet one moment, vicious the next. "One time I asked if I could call my sister," Patricia testified, "and Dorothea said I was being selfish, that I should be grateful she let me live there at all. Then an hour later, she brought me tea and cookies and apologized. It kept you off balance, never sure which version of her you'd get."
That volatility was strategic. It prevented tenants from organizing, from comparing notes, from realizing that Dorothea's kindness was conditional and weaponized. She isolated them from each other, controlling meal times and social interactions, ensuring that loyalty ran vertically to her, never horizontally among themselves. I found a journal kept by one of the victims, Vera Martin, discovered in her room after her body was exhumed. The entries were brief, mundane observations about meals and weather. But the final entry, dated 3 days before her death, read, "Mrs. P says I need to rest more. Gave me special medicine. Feel strange. Hands shaking." That was the last thing Vera ever wrote. 3 days later, she was buried beneath the lawn. And for the next 18 months, Dorothea cashed her social security checks without interruption. The mechanics of the fraud were disturbingly simple. Social Security, in the 1980s, mailed checks to the address on file. For recipients who couldn't manage their own finances, the agency allowed a representative payee, someone authorized to receive and cash checks on their behalf. Dorothea was approved as representative paree for most of her tenants. Once someone died, Dorothea simply didn't report the death. The checks kept coming. She'd forge the signature on the back, deposit the money, and distribute small amounts to surviving tenants to maintain the illusion of financial management. The rest she kept, spending it on clothes, jewelry, and home improvements. Bank records showed she'd made over 300 deposits between 1985 and 1988, totaling more than $150,000. Some checks were cashed the same day the tenant died. Others continued for years after burial. The longest-running fraud involved a woman named Evelyn Sarkash, whose checks Dorothea cashed for 32 months after her death. When investigators finally cross-referenced Social Security disbursements with death records, they found 18 names. People who had lived at 1426 F Street, people whose checks had been cashed long after they'd vanished. Only 7 bodies were found in the garden. The rest remained missing. That number, 18, haunted me. It meant 11 people had disappeared from Dorothea's care without a trace. No bodies, no burial sites, no answers. Had they truly moved away, as Dorothea claimed? Or were they buried somewhere else, in places investigators never thought to search? One detective, now retired, told me he believed Dorothea had accomplices. "There's no way she dug all those graves herself," he said. "She was in her 70s, barely 5 feet tall. Someone helped her. But we could never prove it. Everyone she associated with had either died or refused to talk." That theory, while plausible, was never pursued. The prosecution focused on the 7 bodies they could prove, the 3 murders they could convict. The rest remained speculation, shadows in a case already full of darkness. I spent weeks trying to locate living relatives of the victims. Most had none. They died alone, estranged from family, forgotten by everyone except Dorothea. But I did find one daughter, a woman named Lisa Carpenter, whose mother Leona had been the first body discovered. Lisa agreed to speak with me by phone. She'd never met Dorothea, never visited 1426 F Street. "My mother and I hadn't spoken in years," she said. "She had mental health issues, refused treatment, pushed everyone away. The last I heard, she was living in some boarding house in Sacramento. I assumed she was safe." When police called to say her mother had been found buried in a garden, Lisa felt guilt more than grief. "I should have checked on her," she said. "I should have made sure she was okay. But I was angry at her for so long, for being sick, for being difficult. And by the time I wasn't angry anymore, it was too late." That guilt, that sense of having abandoned a loved one to a monster, was common among the victims' families. They blamed themselves for not staying in touch, for not asking more questions. But the truth is, Dorothea Puente targeted people whose families had already given up. That's what made them perfect victims. The trial brought all of that guilt and grief into public view. Family members testified, weeping, about the last time they'd seen their loved ones. Social workers admitted they'd failed to follow up. Detectives described the horror of excavating the garden, of finding bodies wrapped like gifts, of realizing how long Dorothea had been killing without anyone noticing. Through it all, Dorothea sat calm and composed, occasionally shaking her head as if the testimony were lies she couldn't quite believe. Her attorney argued that the deaths were tragic accidents, that Dorothea had tried to help people who were already dying. But the evidence told a different story. Forensic toxicology showed lethal levels of drugs in every victim. Autopsies revealed signs of suffocation in 2 bodies. And the financial records proved that Dorothea had profited enormously from each death. This wasn't mercy. It was murder for money. The jury took nearly a month to reach a verdict, deliberating longer than almost any jury in California history. They convicted Dorothea of 3 counts of first-degree murder, Leona Carpenter, Dorothy Miller, and Benjamin Fink, but deadlocked on the other 4 charges. The judge declared a mistrial on those counts. Why the jury couldn't agree on all 7 is a question that still bothers legal scholars. Some believe it was age bias, an unwillingness to believe a grandmother capable of such calculating cruelty. Others think it was the circumstantial nature of the evidence. Without eyewitnesses or confessions, some jurors simply couldn't be certain. But 3 convictions were enough. Dorothea was sentenced to life without parole and led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, her face expressionless. She never looked at the families of her victims. She never apologized. She simply walked away, as if the trial had been an inconvenience rather than a reckoning.
Prison changed Dorothea, though not in the ways you'd expect. She adapted quickly, using the same skills that had made her successful in the outside world. She befriended guards, charmed other inmates, and established herself as a kind of prison grandmother, baking cookies in the commissary and offering advice to younger women.
But former inmates I spoke with described a different side. She was manipulative. One woman told me. She'd do favors, but then hold them over your head. If you crossed her, she'd make your life hell. She ran the place like her own boarding house. Dorothea gave interviews to journalists, always maintaining her innocence. Those people were sick when they came to me, she'd say. I cared for them until they died. If someone buried them afterwards, it wasn't me. The deflection was absurd, but she delivered it with such conviction that some reporters left wondering if she actually believed it. In one interview, conducted in 2007, Dorothea was asked if she had any regrets. She paused, looked directly at the camera, and said, "I regret that people didn't appreciate what I did for them. I gave them a home when no one else would. And this is how they repay me." The lack of remorse was chilling. Even after 20 years in prison, Dorothea still saw herself as the victim, betrayed by ungrateful tenants and an unjust system. She'd rewritten the narrative so completely in her mind that guilt had no place to land. Dorothea Puente died on March 27, 2011, in the prison infirmary. She was 82. The cause of death was listed as natural, a phrase that felt almost mocking given the lives she'd taken. She was cremated, her ashes scattered in an undisclosed location. No family claimed her remains. No one attended a memorial. The prison chaplain who'd known her for years later said, "She was the loneliest person I ever met. Not because she was isolated, but because she'd spent so long pretending to be someone she wasn't that I don't think she knew who she really was anymore." That assessment felt right. Dorothea Puente had been performing for so long, husband to husband, con to con, victim to victim, that the real woman beneath the masks had dissolved. What remained was pure function. Charm when useful. Rage when challenged. And always, always, the calculation of profit versus cost. After her death, I returned to Sacramento to visit 1426 F Street one more time. The house had been repainted, the garden paved over and turned into a parking area. New tenants lived there, young professionals who'd bought the property cheap despite its history. They knew what had happened, but they didn't seem bothered. "It's just a house," one of them told me. "The past is the past." But standing there, looking at the windows where Dorothea had once smiled and waved at neighbors, I felt the weight of that past pressing down. 7 bodies buried in this soil. 11 more people missing. And a woman who turned kindness into currency and murder into routine. The house itself seemed ordinary, unremarkable. But I've learned that the worst places often do. Evil doesn't announce itself with Gothic architecture or ominous music. It hides behind flower boxes and fresh paint, behind smiles and cookies and offers of help. Dorothea Puente understood that. She knew that people wanted to believe in kindness, especially when it came from someone who looked like a grandmother. And she used that trust as a weapon, wielding it with precision until the very end. The case files are archived now, sealed away in boxes that future researchers will open and puzzle over, just as I did. They'll see the photographs, read the testimonies, and ask the same questions. How did she get away with it for so long? Why didn't anyone stop her? Could it happen again? The answers are uncomfortable. She got away with it because we have a system that creates vulnerable, invisible people and then forgets about them. No one stopped her because stopping her would have required effort, resources, and a willingness to believe that grandmothers can be monsters. And yes, it could happen again. It probably already is. Somewhere right now, there's a boarding house or care facility where someone is being abused, neglected, or worse. Someone is cashing checks for people who've disappeared. Someone is smiling at inspectors while bodies decompose in a crawl space or basement or garden. Because the conditions that enabled Dorothea Puente haven't changed. We've just gotten better at not looking. That's the true horror of this case. Not that one woman killed 7 people, but that the system allowed it, enabled it, and then moved on without fixing the underlying problems. The social workers still have overwhelming caseloads. The banks still don't verify signatures carefully. And society still has a population of forgotten people whose deaths wouldn't be noticed for months. Dorothea Puente didn't create that system. She just exploited it with ruthless efficiency. And in doing so, she revealed something we'd prefer not to see, that we value convenience over safety, paperwork over people, and the appearance of care over actual protection. The last page of the case file contains a handwritten note from the lead detective. It's dated 1995, years after the trial. I still think about the ones we didn't find. It reads, "The 11 missing. Sometimes I drive past the house and wonder if we missed something. If there are more graves we never uncovered. I'll probably wonder until the day I die." I understand that feeling. Because once you've seen the mechanics of how someone like Dorothea Puente operates, you can't unsee it. You start noticing the gaps in systems, the vulnerable populations, the people who disappear without anyone asking why. And you realize that Dorothea Puente wasn't an aberration. She was a symptom of a much larger problem, a society that creates disposable people and then acts surprised when someone disposes of them. The house at 1426 F Street still stands. The garden has been paved over, but the soil beneath remembers. 7 bodies buried in neat rows, each wrapped with care, each marked with flowers. And somewhere beneath Sacramento streets, perhaps beneath other gardens or parks or buildings, 11 more people might be waiting to be found. Dorothea Puente is gone, cremated and scattered, unmourned and unremembered except as a cautionary tale. But the system that enabled her remains. And until we fix that, until we decide that every life matters, even the difficult ones, the vulnerable ones, the forgotten ones, there will always be another Dorothea Puente. Someone who looks kind and harmless. Someone who offers help with a smile. Someone who buries their mistakes in the garden and keeps cashing the checks. If you like this story, check out the ones on your screen. The dark algorithm thinks you'll enjoy these too.